And obviously, there was ArriveCan also in the AG's report. She did an important report on the use of ArriveCan. The app erroneously sent people to quarantine even though it wasn't supposed to. There was unequal access to people. For people, there were never-ending bugs with the app. And then, Madam Speaker, we know the app cost much, much more. It was way too expensive. It cost $60 million instead of it costed. The honourable member has her phone on vibration. It's causing difficulties. We can hear it vibrate. I'm wondering if she can put it aside. The honourable member for Terrebonne. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I moved my phone away. I'm not sure if it'll change something. I'll put it behind here. So as I was saying, this is the last case, which was ArriveCan, and it was a true fiasco from A to Z. And then when ArriveCan, this scandal was uncovered by the AG roughly a year ago, the first thing that we asked, Madam Speaker, at this stage, because we were fed up of seeing nothing was working at CBSA for years, we asked that it would be put under another agency to be managed. And my colleague made the same request to the government for another program, the GCRA program, which is supposed to provide services. But we know that with more than $500 million that this program cost, it is not even mostly operational at this stage. So how come we've spent $500 million in a program that is managed by an agency, but we still haven't seen any positive results? This is scandalous. It is racking up enormous losses for companies that try to use the portal. It's another fiasco. Is it a future Phoenix? We'll see. Time will tell. But I hope that in the meantime the government will have put a little bit of order at CBSA. So I'll continue, Madam Speaker, because I'm far from finished. In the many reports from the AG, on the government's management during the pandemic, the last report is rather interesting. We have seen that to help companies, the Canadian Emergency Business Account that was established to help 900,000 companies that received a loan that was partly subsidized. And we know many companies benefited from this. Some were kept alive artificially through this. And there were a lot of issues with this program. But what was interesting is, once again, how the government managed this program. And this program, Madam Speaker, well, they decided, someone in the cabinet decided to implement this program. Okay, we were in favor of the creation of the CEBA program. And then what happened, Madam Speaker? There was the finance department that we saw yesterday at committee that was in charge of managing the program. And the Minister of Finance said, no, I don't want to manage it. I'm going to give it to someone else, because we know a Crown corporation doesn't have to follow the same rules and regulations, and they're not as accountable as a department would be. And then the finance department washed its hand of this program, and we know that Export Development Canada was in charge of managing it. And it mentioned to the Department of Finance that it didn't have the capacity to manage this program. And the minister said, oh, don't worry about it, you're still going to do it. And what happened? It asked one company in a non-competitive manner through $330 million to manage this program. So in the end of the day, all of the companies that benefited from this program were served, often very poorly, by this company. So another important point, as my colleague from Trois-Rivières reminded me, I was a bit young at the time, Anderson, the famous Enron and Anderson scandal, that was doing the audit on one side and then also providing advice to companies and hiding all this information. It was doing both at the same time, which is unethical. We know that's no longer the case because we set up regulations since. But Anderson Consulting, when they separated from their audit branch, became Accenture. So it's the same company that was involved here, obviously with a few new people that have arrived, but it's the same company that just changed its name, just changed its brand and image. Accenture managed the CEBA program, and we saw this in the AG's report. Once again, it was very poorly managed. It was poor management of public funds, not just poor management during the pandemic, because there were a lot of people that were poorly served by the program. One example, many companies said they were eligible in the beginning. They received a loan and a subsidy. And then after a year later, a few weeks before they had to pay back the loan, were told, no, you were not eligible. You have to give everything back, including the subsidized portion, which most company that asked for the loan had already spent because they needed that money at the time. So that was the first failure. Second, we know that there was a call center that was created by Accenture. And this call center, Madam Speaker, and the Accenture billed the government for 14 hours, even if the call center was only open for 9 hours. So we know that these call centers were set up much too late. And banks and even the Canadian Federation for Companies had to handle 19,000 calls. So there was an issue, and that's why the call center was set up. And it cost $30 million, this call center. So how many messages did we receive from companies that went unanswered? There was automatic messages talking about callbacks, and there were thousands of companies in distress. And people finally got a hold of an agent after days of trying, and then the agent said, sorry, you don't have an answer for you. So what a super service they offered. It cost $30 million, as a reminder. And then we know Accenture, this company, since it couldn't, EDC couldn't manage everything and had to give everything to this consulting firm. And we know we even asked Accenture to manage a call for tenders process to supposedly be more competitive. And they told Accenture, could you come back and manage this tender progress? Of course, Accenture said, we will give this multi-million dollar contract. It gave itself the contract of several $1 million. Is it acceptable? Absolutely not. Totally unacceptable. And then when the question was asked at the Department of Finance, they are not going to ask for the money back from Accenture, even though we know that they overbilled and they paid too much. And this was not malicious, because as a consultant myself, I know when we bill someone, we're very careful with the bills, because usually the client looks at what's on the bill, and they're really careful to bill the least amount possible. So when you overbill, this was done with an intention to make more money. And once again, Madam Speaker, the responsibility doesn't lie with Accenture. It lies with the government, who we gave a part of our salaries to. That's what this is at the end of the day. Someone who works doesn't even have access to their full salary because they trust that the government will manage this portion of their own salary, of their own work, to provide appropriate services. And that's not what we're seeing, Madam Speaker. It's not what we saw during the pandemic. There were numerous reports from the AG on the government's management of it, and it says it was catastrophic. And this is with public funds, and the Liberal management of public funds is catastrophic. And I'm actually sad to hear that most likely what we'll learn is that the deficit will even be bigger than we expected. And that's what the Liberals do. They give out gifts, and they're not managing public finances properly. So I can go on even at great length about this, because what I'd like to say fundamentally is that throughout the pandemic management, there were certain components that kept on coming back. I mentioned two of them: poor management at the border with CBSA, and poor management of stocks as well. We heard this many times. It's a pandemic situation. We didn't know what to do at the time. This was unprecedented. Okay, well, but And like the Auditor General said on many occasions when we asked her questions, nothing justifies that during a crisis, all our systems and guidelines that were put in place to prevent abuses of public funds were eliminated. There was no longer proper management of policies, whether it's health policies or border management policies. How come everything was just blown up? Why? Because the government was like a deer in the headlights. It didn't wanted to react for weeks in some cases, like in terms of border management. So it's fundamentally shameful. It's truly shameful. In terms of the CEBA account for Canadian companies, what is really surprising is that there was a recommendation that was rejected by the federal government. It was rejected by the Department of Finance. It was simply to reflect on what happened, take a bit of responsibility, and establish an accountability process for the CEBA program. And the minister said, no, we're washing our hands of it. It was a Crown Corporation that has to take this responsibility. And then the Crown Corp says, no, it was the department that is directly responsible because there was a cabinet. And yes, a ministerial responsibility is also the minister's responsibility, not to a Crown Corporation that it mandated to do this job. And the Minister of Finance and Global Affairs Canada gave EDC this mandate of managing the CEBA program. So once again, Madam Speaker, how come the government still does not want to take responsibility for this? In Quebec, last week, the Auditor General of Quebec tabled a report that showed that Crown corporations were poorly managed. And you know what happened that day? The CEO of that Crown Corporation was let go. See how people act when they're responsible to their tax holders. And that's how our government acted. And you know how many people were fired after the ArriveCan scandal? 2 people, even though we know full well that the chain of command went much higher than that. How come no one was held responsible? How come the former president of that agency came to committee and billed CBSA for his time at committee? Yes, the taxpayer paid to ask that person questions and ask the government questions. And that president is currently employed by PricewaterhouseCoopers Waterhouse. So he's being paid by them and also charging CBSA for his preparation time for the Public Accounts Committee appearance. So that is the respect of a former agency president who was there and who saw all of the ArriveCan scandal unfold. It was his responsibility to citizens who pay taxes, who paid much money for this application. So, Madam Speaker, I'd like to conclude on one important point. If the Liberal government wants to take its responsibility, it will have to take some action. We know this is the government is at the end of its term, but it still has to be responsible for at least one report from the Auditor General. What we're seeing is unprecedented. It's a department that is rejecting the recommendations of the AG. And in terms of CBSA, at least for public service, it's well known that there is a culture that is problematic at CBSA. This agency really needs attention. It really needs the government to take things in hand. And we're going to continue to repeat and ask for this until it's solved. But we believe seriously that CBSA should be put under the responsibility of another agency.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And, you know, during the pandemic, the government spends billions and billions of dollars. A worldwide pandemic. It's having an effect on Canadians in every region. And yes, there are going to be some problem areas. There's no doubt about that. But there is also many more success stories. One of the member makes reference to gifts, that we gave gifts. Giving support to seniors during the pandemic, giving support to Canadian workers during the pandemic is not a gift. Madam Speaker, that is something in which we did because it was the right thing to do. I'm wondering if the member would at least acknowledge that those are not gifts, that in fact that it was important that the government step up and support Canadians?
The honourable member for Terrebonne. Well, it's easy for the member to quote something out of context, but I'll give an example. For the GST, there are still tons of companies wondering how they're going to manage this so-called gift. Some gift, it's going to cost companies more money to fix their cash registers than it is going to be an incentive to get people to shop more. So only 4% of businesses think that this is actually going to boost sales, but it's going to cost them from $4,000 to $6,000 to reprogram their cash registers. Nobody believes in this GST gift.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for her speech. She's a well-versed member of the Public Accounts Committee, has done great work there on behalf of many Canadians, and I thank her for that. One of the issues we dealt with in public accounts was hearing from companies, particularly when we heard from pharmaceutical companies during the time of COVID. We've seen that these pharmaceutical companies not only were malicious to Canadians, but they're malicious right across the globe. They sought to actually withhold consent to release the documents and the contracts. What we've seen at that time was these companies were hedging their bets. They were taking advantage of people because they had control over critical vaccine supply. Critical vaccine patents, and they use that in order to abuse countries right across the globe. And what we did in that Public Accounts Committee was review those contracts, the very first instance of that across the globe. Can the member please speak to the importance of transparency for these companies that would take advantage of a crisis?
The honourable member for Terrebonne. I'd really like to thank my colleague for that question, and it's always a pleasure for me to talk about this because it was my motion calling on the government to provide us the COVID vaccine procurement contracts. And I'd like to thank my colleague for his support because it really wasn't easy. The government did not want to provide those contracts. And there was a Public Accounts Committee meeting where we heard the CEOs of Moderna and Pfizer and so on. And we had them... we asked them why it wouldn't be a good idea for us to see those contracts. And this was an in-camera meeting, so we can't reveal the details here. But what my colleague raises is a good point, that this issue is a vulnerability for Canada. We're overcharged for vaccines, and people were dying because they didn't have access. It's a huge problem, Madam Speaker.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. I just want to say that of all the speeches I've had the opportunity to listen to in this House, this one has been remarkable. The depth of understanding and appreciation for what you see she sees happening with this government is something that I share her frustration in, but even more importantly, the vast majority of Canadians, Quebecers, are also frustrated to extreme limits. And, you know, we're talking about the border and the issues around the drugs coming into our country. And I just wonder, she knows that this government decided to remove mandatory minimum penalties for drug dealers. And I would like to know what her perspective is on whether it was appropriate in any way, because I really think we give these Liberals more benefit of the doubt than we should. Is it appropriate that they signaled more leniency on drug dealers who even right now, with premeditation, are benefiting from the addiction and death of Canadians because of what this government has done?
The honourable member for Terrebonne. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her question and for her comments. That's highly appreciated. We've worked for a long time on public accounts and for very little reaction from the government, so that does generate some frustration, you'll understand, Madam Speaker. So I'll have to go back and speak to my colleagues who are more comfortable with legal issues, but I think fundamentally the problem here is border management, and my colleague's absolutely right. The border is a sieve. People can cross back and forth with weapons, with guns, with stolen vehicles and so on. There's huge problems with CBSA. And it's our responsibility, and that's why we want a CBSA placed under third-party management. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her very specific speech, once again. Very accurate speech. As my colleague said, the border is porous. There's a lack of control and lack of action from the government. So I'd like her to comment on the fact that the government has announced it will be that the government of Quebec has had to deploy resources to the border, even though it's not their jurisdiction or responsibility. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Thank you, Madam Speaker. This gives me a good opportunity to talk about the fact that the provincial government, the Quebec government, is often much more competent in managing the border than the federal government is through the RCMP or CBSA. So this is a great opportunity, Madam Speaker, to say how much better off Quebec would be if we could control or manage the border ourselves.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. During the pandemic, what we've seen, I think, in two instances was, one, a very large crisis, not just a national crisis, but a global crisis. And of course, during these kinds of global crises, there are a tendency, particularly in democratic nations, to see this polarization, this mistrust grow, in particular to the crisis. And of course, there was a lot of mistrust of the government predating the pandemic. Going into the pandemic, there was even more mistrust. How do you think mistrust plays a role in the kind of lack of civility or decorum across our country, especially during that time? Because there's two kinds of Canadians now. There's the Canadians that were united before the pandemic, and then there's Canadians divided after it. It's a difficult and sad thing to realize, but that level of mistrust and that erosion it has on our democracy, would the member please comment?
L'honorable député
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. That's an excellent question. I really enjoy sitting with this member on the Public Accounts Committee because we can certainly see what the government's doing right sometimes, but also we see what they're doing wrong. And if there's anything that erodes public trust in the government is the lack of accountability. And I gave an example in Quebec. The Auditor General tabled a report on how poorly managed things were. And that very same day, the government fired the CEO of that department, or that agency. So that just shows it's all about public trust in institutions. And this is being eroded all around the world. And Canada is right up there. And that's certainly something we can blame the Liberal government for. We have time for one last quick question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, and I think there's ample examples of where the government within itself often takes actions that are necessary in order to show transparency and accountability. And we saw that in regards to the pandemic also, where there is misappropriate behavior from a company or an individual, where there's attempts to recover finances and allow for the RCMP to do the work that needs to be done, where there's criminal involvement. Would she not also see that as a positive thing?
The Honourable Member has 50 seconds to answer. Well, I agree that when the RCMP decided finally to investigate, parliamentarians had been calling for that for a long time, but I'd like to see the results of that inquiry because we've seen a lot of cases with STDC where there was misappropriation of funds. Then that's another example of this government's mismanagement. But I'll take advantage of this answer to say that in that case, the CEO themselves had funneled money to a crony, even though there was none of the eligibility requirements were met. But with STDC, this is just happens all the time. There's misuse and nobody's held accountable.